Hey there, and thanks for stopping by. I'm genuinely happy you're watching this video, and if you feel like subscribing, it would honestly mean a lot to me. Let's not waste any time and get right into the story. I'm James, and for almost 10 years I was convinced I was living a dream. I was married to Danielle, a woman I thought checked every box. We were together for just over 9 years, and I honestly believed our relationship was one of those rare ones that other people envied. Danielle was sharp, stunning, and seemed to share my core values, especially around love, fidelity, and family life. When our son came into the picture, I truly felt like life had given me everything I'd hoped for. I dedicated myself to being the kind of man I'd always envisioned, both as a husband and a dad. I worked longer hours, took on more duties at work, anything to make sure Danielle and our son were never in need. But I didn't limit my role to just being a provider. I made sure I was deeply involved in our son's life. I rearranged my schedule to be at his school functions, and our weekends were often spent building blanket forts or just hanging out together. Danielle used to tell me how much she valued the fact that I wasn't just there financially, I was emotionally present too. Her friends even made comments about it. I'd overhear them talking about how absent their own partners were. They'd talk about missed anniversaries or husbands skipping their children's events, and Danielle would nod and say how grateful she was. That made me proud. I liked being the guy other women wished their husbands were more like. I never missed reading bedtime stories, always remembered meaningful dates, and actually enjoyed being with my family. When someone asked how I managed everything, I always said the same thing. Family comes first. Everything else can wait. Danielle had a tight group of longtime girlfriends who were often at our place. There was Anna, her husband was a successful lawyer. Then Beverly, whose partner Robert traveled constantly for work. And then there was Barbara. She'd been a close part of Danielle's life for years. She always greeted me with warmth, and she and Danielle connected over things like books, cooking, and planning events. Over time, Barbara's own relationship began to fall apart. Danielle would come home and tell me about Barbara's struggles, how her husband was becoming difficult, how the divorce was dragging on. She tried to be there for her friend, inviting her for dinners or just coffee so she wouldn't feel so alone. Back then, I felt genuinely sorry for Barbara. She seemed broken over the collapse of her marriage, and it was clear Danielle's support meant a lot. When Barbara joined us for meals, she'd sometimes get teary talking about how hard starting over was. Danielle would try to lift her spirits, reminding her of her strength and potential for happiness ahead. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder how much of that sadness was real. But at the time, I just saw a woman navigating a painful season in her life. I didn't think twice when she started showing up more often or asking about my weekend plans. That is, until one specific Saturday morning turned my entire world upside down. That day, Danielle had gotten up early and jotted down a to-do list, errands, a few stores she wanted to visit, and maybe some other stops along the way. I was looking forward to a quiet day at home with our son, who was excited about a school project he'd been planning for weeks. Danielle headed out sometime in the morning. A while later, my son and I were fully immersed in his project when I heard footsteps on the porch. I wasn't expecting Danielle back anytime soon. She'd mentioned she might be gone for hours. When the doorbell rang, I walked over to the window to peek outside. Barbara was standing on the steps, but she looked different. Not like her usual weekend self. She was dressed up, more polished, hairstyled, makeup done. It wasn't the relaxed, post-divorce Barbara I'd gotten used to seeing. I figured she had some plans and just dropped by to see Danielle quickly. I opened the door and said hello. She smiled and asked if Danielle was home. That caught me off guard because Danielle's car wasn't even in the driveway. I told her she'd gone out and might not be back for a bit. That's when Barbara said something I now recognize as a huge red flag. She told me she already knew Danielle wasn't home. She'd called ahead, but she still wanted to come in. Said she needed someone to talk to and didn't want to be alone. At the time, it seemed like more of the same emotional strain she'd been under. I'd seen how deeply she leaned on Danielle during the divorce, and this just felt like another moment she needed support. The fact that she came over knowing Danielle wasn't there made me think she must be really struggling. So, I let her in, just like I always did when Danielle's friends dropped by. My son was still focused on his project, and everything seemed completely normal. Barbara went straight to her usual chair by the living room window. I took my usual place on the couch. We made small talk. I asked how she was holding up. She said that starting over was both terrifying and oddly liberating. She asked how work was going, and I gave her a quick update on a project I'd been handling. The first 20 minutes or so felt like any other of her visits. We talked about mutual friends, weekend plans, nothing out of the ordinary. The only thing that felt a little strange was how she kept scanning the room, like she was taking mental inventory. The family photos, the decorations Danielle had picked, all the little things that made the house ours. But sometimes people just look around like that, especially if they've been in your space a lot. So I brushed it off. My son came into the room for a minute to say hi to Barbara. She greeted him like usual, with warmth and familiarity. After a short exchange, he went back to working on his school project. And then, something shifted. Barbara's demeanor changed. The warmth was gone. She got quiet. Her answers became short. The casual, easy rhythm of conversation we'd been having evaporated. She reclined slightly in her chair, fixing her eyes on me with a look that made my skin prickle. I couldn't explain it at the time, but something about her stare felt invasive, like she was quietly examining something hidden inside me. After a few long seconds, she stood up with deliberate slowness. I assumed she was stretching, or maybe about to get a drink. I opened my mouth to ask if she needed anything, but didn't get the words out. Barbara crossed the room instead and sat directly next to me, not at the other end of the couch where there was plenty of space, but right beside me, close enough that our legs were in contact. A strong wave of her perfume hit me, more intense than usual. Then, without a word, she calmly laid her hand on my thigh, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My thoughts instantly collapsed. It was that kind of frozen shock where your brain refuses to register what's happening. Barbara, Danielle's old friend, someone who'd spent years at our dinner table, who knew our son, was now sitting far too close, touching me in a way I couldn't explain, while my wife was out and our child was just a few steps away in his bedroom. I stared down at her hand like it didn't belong, like it was something foreign. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was some misguided attempt at humor, maybe she was dealing with some personal breakdown, but deep inside, I already understood what was going on, and I was terrified. The silence between us felt eternal, even though it was only a few seconds. Finally, I shook myself from the paralysis and looked directly at her. I asked, as evenly as I could, what she thought she was doing. She didn't hesitate. She looked right back and asked if I didn't think she was attractive. Her words hit like a gut punch. There was no more ambiguity, no way to misread or rationalize. She was making a pass at me, right there in my home, with my wife expected back any minute and our child within earshot. Before I could respond, she leaned in closer. She began speaking softly, her tone low and intimate. She told me she'd felt incredibly alone since her divorce, that lately she couldn't stop thinking about me, that her feelings had grown too strong to ignore. She said she had been waiting for a moment like this, just the two of us. And I sat there, listening to this woman Danielle trusted like a sister, admit she'd been orchestrating this situation for some time. The sense of betrayal was almost as sharp as her advance. This wasn't a fleeting lapse in judgment, it had been planned. I shot to my feet, managing to keep my voice controlled as I told her it was time to leave. There was no anger in my tone, just certainty. Her face changed in an instant. The vulnerability she'd just expressed vanished, replaced with something cold and venomous. She stood slowly, adjusted her blouse, and grabbed her purse. I expected her to leave without a word, maybe mutter a regret. But at the doorway, she turned around and delivered a final blow I never saw coming. She told me I was an idiot, blindly loyal to a woman she called a whore, and too naive to realize I was raising someone else's child. Then she left, slamming the door behind her, while I stood frozen, unable to move. I stayed in that spot, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. First came the fury. Who did she think she was? Coming into my home and slandering my wife like that. How dare she lash out with such filth just because I rejected her? But even through the rage, a seed of doubt took hold. What if it wasn't just an act of revenge? Why would she say something so specific, so destructive, unless she believed it herself? Why risk her relationship with Danielle by saying something so outrageous? I tried to shake it off. I focused on the present. My son was still in his room, blissfully unaware. Danielle would be back soon. I debated whether I should tell her right away. Let her know that Barbara had crossed a boundary that couldn't be repaired. But I didn't. Something held me back. Maybe it was the certainty in Barbara's voice, the bite in her words, the way she said them like facts, not insults. The longer I sat with it, the more I realized I needed answers before I confronted my wife. Later that afternoon, Danielle returned with a handful of shopping bags. I forced myself to stay composed. When she asked how the day had gone, I said our son and I had worked on a school project. She smiled and launched into stories about her errands. I smiled back, but something in me had shifted. That night, and every moment after, I looked at her, and at our son, with new eyes. He always resembled Danielle more than me, but I'd never thought anything of it. Children often resemble one parent more. But now, I found myself noticing details I'd ignored. His features weren't clearly mine. They weren't clearly hers either. The thought made me feel sick. I hated myself for even questioning it. But Barbara's words had taken hold, and they weren't leaving. Over the following days, the doubt grew. I started obsessing, going over memories, timelines, mannerisms, trying to recall exactly when he had been conceived and whether the dates lined up. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't accuse Danielle without proof. I needed certainty. If Barbara had said it out of bitterness, I had to know. And if she hadn't, I needed the truth even more. So, I began researching paternity tests. There were plenty of discreet at-home options, with private results available in just a few weeks. The instructions were simple. I followed them carefully, gathered the samples, and sent them in. Then came the waiting, the most agonizing wait of my life. Those few weeks stretched endlessly. On the outside, I kept up the illusion. School projects, family dinners, work. But inside, I was crumbling. Every glance at my son brought new uncertainty. Every affectionate look from Danielle filled me with silent dread. She noticed the change. She asked if I was okay, said I seemed preoccupied. I told her I was under stress, and it was the truth. The pressure of waiting for those results was eating me alive. One ordinary afternoon during the week, I pulled into the driveway and noticed a plain envelope from the DNA testing center peeking out of the mailbox. Instead of bringing it inside, I tore it open right there in the driver's seat. I didn't want to risk Danielle getting to it before I did, especially if she happened to be home. The results were crystal clear and final. The analysis stated with complete certainty, 0% probability, that I was not the biological father of the boy I had believed was my son. I stayed frozen behind the wheel, staring at that one damning sentence, trying and failing to process what it truly meant. In an instant, every bedtime story, school run, birthday celebration, and proud fatherly moment was swept away. The child I had loved unconditionally, the boy I thought was my own flesh and blood, wasn't mine at all. But the blow that hit hardest wasn't the genetic truth. It was the deeper betrayal buried within it. Danielle had carried another man's child and let me live in ignorance. She had smiled at me, held me, and built a life with me, all while maintaining a lie of staggering proportions. I thought back to the time she had praised me in front of friends, gushing about what a devoted partner and father I was. I remembered the long hours I willingly put in, thinking I was securing a better future for our family. I saw again, in my mind, every moment of closeness I'd shared with the boy, never suspecting I was being deceived. Not once had Danielle hinted there was a hidden truth. The enormity of the deception struck me with a suffocating force. I didn't move from the car for a long time, gripping the paper that had undone the entire narrative of my life. That night, after putting the boy to bed, I asked Danielle to meet me in the living room. Something in my tone must have tipped her off because she seemed uneasy, though she sat down as if nothing unusual was happening. I told her that Barbara had come by earlier that day and had said something troubling. Something about our marriage. Danielle's face tightened with irritation and confusion. She immediately began questioning Barbara's motives, citing how distant they'd grown recently. But instead of quoting Barbara, I silently handed Danielle the DNA results. She took the pages and stared at them for a long time, reading the words as if they were foreign. When the realization finally dawned, her face lost all color. She looked up at me, her expression twisted with panic and disbelief. Her first instinct was denial. She claimed Barbara must be lying, that perhaps someone had manipulated the report to hurt us. She brought up Barbara's family and how they'd never approved of our relationship, insinuating that this could be their way of driving a wedge between us. She insisted it had to be a hoax. I calmly told her the test was real. It came from a licensed lab, and I had taken every step myself. I explained how I had collected the samples, mailed them in, and tracked the entire process. There was no margin for error. Danielle kept scanning the document, visibly searching for some explanation that would undo what she was reading. Eventually, the tears came. Her hands trembled as she looked back at me, and then she turned the focus on me. She demanded to know how I could betray her trust by running a DNA test without her knowledge. She called it a violation of our marriage. I told her plainly that the results didn't lie, and she had a choice: explain the truth or stop deflecting and admit it. When she realized there was no more room to twist the situation, she finally collapsed. Sobbing uncontrollably, her body shook as she tried to speak. At last, she told me everything. In the early years of our marriage, when I was always away working, trying to build something for us, she had an affair. She said it was brief, that she ended it when she realized she was pregnant. At the time, she convinced herself that I might still be the father and decided not to question it further. I asked why, after the baby was born and likely didn't resemble me, she didn't come clean. She said she had buried the possibility deep, believing that acknowledging the truth would only cause destruction. As the years went on, it got easier to pretend. She told herself that because I loved the boy so completely, that's what truly mattered. I asked her if she had ever thought about getting her own DNA test, even just for peace of mind. She admitted the idea had crossed her mind occasionally, but she never followed through. She was too afraid of what she might find. Knowing the truth, she said, would have threatened the life she'd built on the lie. And then she said the words that haunted me most. She had refused to have another child with me all these years because she feared that a second child might expose the truth she'd been hiding. As she sat there unraveling everything, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the woman I thought I'd known, the one I had stood by, believed in, sacrificed for. This was someone else entirely. She had deceived me from the very beginning, shaping our family around a story that wasn't true. I told her I needed time and that I would be sleeping in the guest room. She held on to me, crying, begging me not to walk away. She promised we could fix this together, that we just needed to face it honestly. But I couldn't even look her in the eye. Everything I thought was real had been undone. That night, I drove for hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally came back home in the early morning, she was still awake, waiting. She tried again to talk, to reconnect, to keep us from falling apart. But I told her I wasn't ready and went straight to the guest room without another word. Over the next several days, Danielle made every effort to hold things together. She kept repeating that, no matter what the report said, the boy was still my son in every meaningful way. She insisted that love, not biology, was what defined a father. And part of me agreed. I did love him. The thought of losing that bond was unbearable. But every time I looked at him now, I saw more than just my son. I saw the embodiment of a lie I had lived for years. After night upon night of lying awake and listening to Danielle's desperate attempts to reach me, I reached a conclusion I didn't want to face. I could no longer live under the same roof. Trust, our marriage's foundation, had been shattered beyond repair. I began the legal proceedings to bring it all to an end. I knew divorce would come with grief and complexity, but continuing the charade felt even worse. When Danielle was finally served the papers, weeks later, she reacted with fury and heartbreak. She refused to accept it. She pleaded with me to reconsider, proposing everything from therapy to a trial separation, anything but final separation. She kept repeating that it had been a single error in judgment from years ago, promising me that since then she'd been faithful and fully committed. But to me, it was never just one isolated mistake. The affair itself was devastating. But what made it far worse was the long, deliberate concealment that followed. Every day that passed without the truth felt like a fresh betrayal. Each time she called me an incredible father, each time she watched me sacrifice for the family I thought was ours, every moment she let me bond with a child under false assumptions, none of that felt accidental. It was a continuous performance of the same lie. And when it became clear that Danielle had no intention of coming clean, the only path left was through the courts. What followed was a prolonged, tangled legal ordeal, dividing assets, negotiating responsibilities, parsing obligations. But the most gut-wrenching piece of it all wasn't the financial back and forth. It was the legal gray area concerning the boy. Since I wasn't biologically related, my status as his father had no automatic legal standing. Danielle tried to use that ambiguity as leverage in her favor. I, on the other hand, had the option to walk away entirely. No legal duties, but also no rights. That decision tore at my soul. I cared for him deeply. Still, I understood that staying in his life meant staying tethered to Danielle, and to the lie that had slowly rotted the foundation of our marriage. In the end, I chose to cut ties completely. It was the only way to move forward. The divorce dragged on for months. Danielle fought it every step of the way. She seemed to think that stalling might somehow change my mind. But when the final agreement was signed, she received what the court considered a fair settlement, enough support to help her start again. I made sure the language made one thing crystal clear. I was meeting my responsibilities as her ex-husband, not as the parent of a child who wasn't mine. The divorce was finalized on a cold, bleak day, long after the DNA results had shattered my world. I signed the final documents and walked out of a marriage I had once believed would last forever. That moment was the last time I ever spoke to Danielle. For weeks, my wedding ring sat untouched in a drawer as I debated what to do with it. Eventually, I threw it away, along with everything else that reminded me of the life we had built. But the part that cut the deepest wasn't the end of the marriage. It was not knowing what had become of the boy. He stayed in my thoughts constantly. I often wondered how he was handling our absence, whether Danielle had told him anything close to the truth, and whether he ever thought of me, even a little, the way I still thought of him. But deep down, I knew that reaching out would only cause more turmoil. What he needed most was stability, not the emotional tug-of-war of staying connected to someone who could no longer be part of his day-to-day life. As for Barbara, I never truly found out what happened between her and Danielle after the truth came to light. I suspected Danielle must have confronted her for revealing what she had kept hidden. But whether their friendship survived the fallout, I never knew. I also never learned whether Barbara regretted how she chose to break the news to me. I sometimes asked myself if Barbara had always known or if Danielle had let something slip during one of their talks. Maybe Barbara acted out of spite after I turned her down, or maybe she genuinely believed I had a right to know. In the end, her motives didn't change the outcome. What mattered was that she cracked open the illusion I'd been living inside, a lie that had defined my reality for years. And when I look back, I can admit there had been signs I ignored. Danielle's reluctance to have more children, the uncomfortable silence when someone commented on how the boy didn't look like me, her defensive reactions whenever someone joked about paternity. But I had trusted her so completely, had believed so strongly in the life we were building, that I never questioned the foundation beneath it all. My trust had been total, and that made the betrayal absolute. That period of my life taught me something difficult, but necessary. When trust is shattered at its core, there's no apology or regret strong enough to fully repair it. Living next to someone who had lied so profoundly about something so intimate became unbearable no matter how much history we shared. And even now, I still wonder if I made the right choices during that chapter. I'll never be sure whether there was a better way to handle what Danielle did, especially in terms of the boy who had meant so much to me. I question whether I should have found a way to separate my feelings for him from the pain she caused. But one thing I do know is that everything changed the moment Barbara came to my door that Saturday. In the span of a few minutes, she delivered a truth that had been hidden from me for years, a truth that made it impossible to keep pretending my life was what I thought it was. Sometimes, the biggest revelations come from people we'd never expect, people whose intentions we may never fully understand. Sometimes the truths we need are delivered out of anger, jealousy, or self-interest. But they're truths all the same, and they force us to face what we've avoided for too long. I'll never know what might have happened if Barbara had chosen to stay silent that day. I'll never know how long I would have kept living the lie. But this much is certain. As painful as it was, hearing the truth was better than continuing in ignorance. That day obliterated everything I believed about my marriage, my family, and my own identity. But it also gave me the opportunity to start over, to build something honest from the ruins, even if I had to do it by myself. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. I'd truly appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story moved you, I hope you'll check out the other videos on this channel. Until next time, take care, my friend.